Hello, welcome to yet another episode of the Bajeti Speaks podcast, where we unpack some of the public finance issues, concerns, and aspects that we do come across in our country. And today's conversation will be focusing on a subject or that topic that is very close to service delivery, and that is budget credibility. With me in studio are two brilliant gentlemen who are going to be helping us unpack that very important subject, because every year we have governments, national and county, that prepare budgets, and we expect to see the results at the end of it all. But somewhere in between, certain things shift. So why is that? And how do we explain it? How do we become better at, having credible budgets, but also implementing them well for equitable service delivery? So I'll invite the two gentlemen with me in studio to introduce themselves. And as they do that, please share with us one word that you'd use to describe the current state of budget credibility today. So we'll start with you, Kip Korir.
Thank you, Fidan. My name is Kip Korir Piekon, and I work with Bajeti Hub as Program Officer, Research and Analysis. And one word that comes into my mind when we talk about budget credibility, of course, in the current state I feel it's unresolved. And when you look at the issues that we have been raising on budget credibility, it's like long overdue. Some of the issues have been consistently raised, but of course there are little improvements that you can be able to see from the issues that are being asked by either public or even us as CSOs in that sense. And also sometimes you will also see, just saying unresolved, of course also there's inconsistencies that you can also be able to observe from that. Yeah, really, that's what I can say about that.
And resolved. So it means there are certain things that need to be addressed for us to progress. Yes. John.
Thanks and hello. So my name is John Kinuthia. I also work with Bajeti Hub as the Deputy Executive Director. The one word that comes to mind for me is trust, because I think public budgets are about the social contract between government and its citizens. And that social contract is built on trust. So how we implement budgets and realize the benefits of paying taxes and what government is supposed to provide is heavily built on a trust that both sides will play their role. So when that doesn't happen, then that trust is broken.
All right. So those two words are on different ends of the spectrum, I would say, trust and unresolved. Hopefully we get to see where they intersect. But even as we dive into the conversation, and I'd like to start with you, John. First, what is budget credibility? To those people who are wondering why we're using this term. But even then, and what we hope to do in today's conversation is get a sense of where the challenges are, why the gaps persist, and what can be done to improve things. So why budget credibility, and why was it important for us as Bajeti Hub to conduct research around this subject, which we'll be discussing a bit of the findings later on. And what is the end goal of this?
Thank you. So budget credibility is fancy English, basically to speak about the ability of government to implement its budget well. So the credibility part of the word is basically saying that we have a sound enough fiscal policy, or we have a sound enough policy of how we develop and spend our money to be able to realize the goals of any budget that we approve. So in a nutshell, budget credibility is the ability of government to raise and spend resources as approved through the government budgeting processes that we have. Now, for us in Kenya, and the context today is good as a point of reflection, is the fact that as a country, we've been speaking a lot about the challenges of the space in terms of the resources that the government has to generate enough money to spend on their never-ending list of priorities. As we know, with our current public debt situation, right? So we are spending a huge amount of our domestic resources to repay debt. So that means there's less money to go around to do new things. So that means that for every shilling that now goes into our budget, we even are under more pressure and probably more responsibility to be able to make sure it's spent well, and there's more value for that shilling. So for us, looking at how we are implementing budgets in this current context then becomes a really important step to take. And for us at Bajeti Hub, that means having a good picture, generating as much evidence as we can on how budget implementation is playing out at the national level and at the county level. We did one on the county level a few years back, and so the research that we've just put out now is focused at the national level as well. So for us, we see this as an opportunity to really try and generate and get a good picture of how then are we spending? Is the government really maximizing the value of the shilling? Is the government even spending that shilling in the first place as intended? Because the current fiscal space requires that we be very prudent, very efficient in how we do it. And more importantly, that then the priorities that we are putting in the current context, I would assume are very hard pressed to get enough money to be fully implemented. So the context demands of us to pay a bit more attention on just how are we spending money, because we don't have a lot of it to go around in the current situation.
And that matters for every citizen, that it is something that concerns each and every one of us, because if we have little to go around, then that affects healthcare, it affects education, service delivery, it affects water and sanitation, it affects trade. We may assume certain things, but for our mama mbogas and the boda people, it affects everyone basically. So John has let us know that there was a study that was conducted, and Keep You led that study just to understand the state of budget credibility at the national level. What would you say surprised you most? But also just give us a brief overview of some of the findings in terms of overspending, underspending, because those are the deviations. You can either underspend or overspend, and perhaps what other patterns may have emerged as you are conducting the study and analyzing the findings.
Thank you, Vedan. Yes, I think one of the things that was surprising was, of course, in most cases, you usually think about expenditure and saying that expenditure could be a problem. But I think from this study, what we found was, because expenditure is more of a problem more than a revenue. And the reason why I'm saying that is you realize that revenue is somewhat credible. Like from the study, it showed. And we found that, of course, the government is only failed because like the under collection of revenue is about 6%. Like it's almost not far from when you talk about it's credible. But when you compare with the other side of expenditure, which was more like it's about 12%, like the national government underspent by 12%. And when you talk about that 12%, it's not, it looks a small percentage, but when you try to extrapolate it with the resources that goes to the sectors in Kenya, so we have 10 sectors. So we have health, education, water, of course, environment, agriculture, like the 10 sectors that we have at the national government. And these sectors, for example, in 2021-2022 financial year, it took around 1.9 trillion. Like they were allocated 1.9 trillion. And when you talk about like you are underspending by 12%, that's around 140 billion. It's a lot of resources. Like it looks small percentage, but it's quite a lot. Yeah, but that was something that was very surprising for me. For instance, for that to say revenue and expenditure is really something that. But then when it comes to the major findings that of course we found in this study, one of the major findings was development in all the sectors. All the sectors, of course, they were under. There was an underspending across all the sectors in development side of the budget. When you compare that with the recurrent, where you tend to find sometimes there is an overspending in the recurrent. So those two classifications have their budget, like they spend the budget differently, and it's also an issue, and of course recurrent budget there was only 1% like underspend in recurrent side of the budget, like only 1%. Like they spend the sector spend around 99% of their recurrent budget, but development it's 76%, meaning there is around 24% of the development budget that is not spent. And remember what John have just said, like we really depend, like in a country like ours where we have around 40% of the country people like they poverty around that percentage, and those people entirely depend on on basic services that government is supposed to offer. It's a challenge that, of course, it's clear. Like for these people, the only thing that they depend on is more of the service that government is supposed to provide. But then when you see government, of course, leaning more like towards, of course, the recurrent is you cannot avoid. For instance, salaries and all that you have to pay at the end of the day. But also we have to look at development, especially in a country like ours, which we still need such. But also when you come to the sectors, for instance, education and health, which is more of the recurrent, that's more recurrent side of the budget compared to development. You still find the challenges of development still emanating, like they're featuring. And they're also part of the sectors that they didn't, of course, performed well, as we, of course, you sometimes expect. Say, since education is more recurrent, you would expect that it will spend most of its budget. But development was clear that they didn't fully utilize the budget, the development that they are given, despite its small budget. But for health, realize it's almost also the same with the overall budget credibility. They had an underspend of 12% at the national level, meaning despite when the challenges that we are also seeing, like we still see there are facilities which are still facing challenges. Although we know health is more default, but there's also a section which national government is supposed to ensure that they also be able to offer the services around that. But of course, you still see that those underspend, and of course, it's also cut across all other sectors. Like you see those emerging, and there's a measure which is used by PEFA. It's called Public Expenditure Financial Accountability, and it should rate. So it should rate sectors. So government, of course, is the one which is supposed to rate themselves. And you could see the finding also, of course, showed that, of course, you could see these sectors having a score of C+ and D+, like between there. Meaning, if you are to get an A, you have really, the sector should really be able to be disciplined, like to spend as it commit. But sometimes there are challenges that goes beyond. So you'll find some of the challenges that probably might be beyond, of course, sometimes disbursement is one of the issues that also emerge from the study. And in most cases, you tend to find most of the disbursement that national treasury is supposed to disburse to ministries, department, and agencies, so which also comprises and some it form the sectors, comes towards the end of the financial year. And financial year starts from July 1st, and of course it ends in June 30th the following year. So and it is also categorized into 4 quarters. So when you find national treasury releasing funds towards the end of the financial year, then these ministries and agencies will have less time also to spend. So it's a challenge, meaning if you get resources maybe in June, then or in May, then of course you have 2 months. And of course, remember development, of course there also are the process that needs to be followed, procurement and all that. Meaning even those processes should be given time. So and in such cases, process are a challenge. And what also John said about public debt. So it's still related to this. And also remember, our revenue, we collect as we use. Usually something that we in Kenya, that's what we do. And sometimes when, of course, there are shortfalls, it also means there'll be some process that also should be able to come in to assist that, and those challenges to emerge. Yes, but generally that's the state, because it is general underspending. There are also other things that we'll speak about on supplementary budgets. And yeah, thanks.
All right. I think it's very important what you have mentioned in terms of the underspend. And when you work out the proportions, you realize that it's in the billions. So then the question is, if it's in the billions, what could have been done? What had been planned and what was not done? So, and what does that mean for the services that you've said that most people are reliant on public services? What does that mean for those people who are reliant on public services that do not end up being provided? But I also liked what you brought out about the discrepancy between the credibility on the side of revenue versus the credibility on the side of expenditure, because it seems that we're not doing very badly when it comes to revenue and meeting our revenue targets. We are not there yet, but it's looks a bit better compared to the expenditure side and just how much we're able to absorb and some of the challenges. So it would mean that this is not, yes, it may be a revenue challenge, but it's not solely a revenue challenge. And you brought out the issue of exchequer releases, the delayed disbursements, the procurement processes. Are there perhaps any other drivers of this poor budget credibility that are beyond those two?
Yes. So there's also a donor, because some of the resources that, of course, we government fund its sectors is from donors. Like it's donor funded. And sometimes also donor funds comes with conditions. Or it comes with, sometimes there are delays that comes with this. And I will cite a very good, of course, an example. So you tend to find sometimes when government, let's say it is a project that probably is funded by donors, and there are conditions that has not been met, then those resources will not be released by donor. Then it means at the end of it, there will be delays. So government, of course, will not be able to get those resources, and eventually the credibility will be one of the things that will be affected at the end of it all. And of course also something also that was in the recent past was also, we have, I think maybe some of us could have heard of this, because when there are shifts in government, like talk about the supplementary budgets, and supplementary budgets are not entirely bad. We shall say sometimes it comes to course correct what was not well done or what was not foreseen. But in most cases, probably they have been maybe misused, or usually say probably sometimes they have been misused. And you will find in a sector, and of course, let's talk about health. You'll find in health, probably supplementary budget could have worked positively towards, probably health is prioritized, maybe in supplementary budgets. But when you go to other sectors, you'll find it does negate. Like in every supplementary budget that comes, there's a reduction in certain sectors. But in some, there could be an increase, which is it applies in some sectors, and it's a bad thing in other sectors. But even with that, even if the resources is increased, like let's say for health, then of course also it will contribute to credibility. You'll find in some instances there is an increase maybe to a certain program by 20%. Like that's a huge, so the 20% to a certain program is quite significant. And these are the resources that came in within the year. Let's say it's supplementary 2 or supplementary 1, 3 in some instances. It means it's a challenge, because these were the resources that were not planned for at the initial part of the year, when the year started. So it means when using those resources, probably sometimes when could be a challenge. And eventually it will lead to credibility issues. Because in most cases, any increase in resources, probably there is high chance that there will be credibility issue, especially the underspending part. And of course also, even with supplementary, in most cases, the side that even serves most is the development side, the capital side of the budget. Like that's usually in most cases, there's a reduction you'll expect. Even in the overall, because also in the sectors, and even in the programs, you'll then find that in most cases, the reduction will be on the side of the capital, then the increase will be on the side of the recurrent. And even when we talk about this recurrent, these are the resources that goes to personnel, so the salaries, these are the resources that goes to travel, in those who love, of course, the government and all those things that are recurrent in nature. Maintenance, yes, because we expect to see the projects that probably, let's say water, they are maintained and all that. And of course, in such cases, you tend to find there are those challenges, especially in those social service kind of sectors. But remember, also in the question that was you asked, like when there is this underspend, who will tend to suffer? Like at the end of the day, any resources that are allocated, or there is something that is supposed to achieve at the end of the financial year. Because government is saying at the end of the year, we'll need to have built certain number of classes, let's say to support JSS, the junior secondary school and all that. And if at the end of the financial year, they have not utilized certain resources, it means there are some classes that were not constructed. And in such cases, it means when the quality of it, like it connects to the services. And of course, even in our country where we are still looking about, there are quite a number of pupils or children who are still left out of school. And even in our country, again, which is still, that most of the young, like our country is young aged. And even in some reports, it indicates that around 40% of Kenyans are actually less than 15 years, which they are quite significant. And they still need these this working classroom so that they can be able to study and do all that. Yeah, generally they tend to suffer most because of course the resources that was supposed to assist that people is not well utilized as this internet. Because remember, these are commitments that government is making and saying for us to achieve this, we are supposed to allocate these resources at optimal. But of course, we know also in Kenya there is no sector which usually get the resources that they will say this is enough for us. So there are still those challenges, of course, on resources that are available. So it's competing needs. But we have to utilize, as John said, the ceiling that we have, we really have to utilize to achieve what we need to see the change.
Okay. I think I'd just like to pick up from that last point and shift to you, John, because you've said we've conducted such kind of work, research, budget credibility, even at the county level. But even beyond that, some of the issues that Kip has highlighted for us while giving the overview, they're not new. So we still either keep speaking about the same things over and over again. Maybe they just change a little bit in terms of how these challenges manifest. Why are we constantly here? And what is not being done that should be done to ensure that year on year we are not talking about delayed exchequer releases leading to underspending. We're not talking about supplementary budgets leading to underspending. And maybe you can also touch a bit more on the donor funding side of things in terms of this external financing that we rely on, especially for development projects, and how it not being realized in good time leads to underspending in development that is quite significant.
I think there are a couple of things that definitely remain a challenge at the foundational level. The examples that Kip has given, whether it's late disbursement of money, whether it's the need to revise the budget while we just passed it. Those things speak to symptoms that go beyond just the numbers not adding up. There are certain underlying conditions that lead to that, and I'll speak to a couple of them. So one is we have to ask who is accountable for underspending. So who is held accountable for underspending? Is there an incentive to hold somebody, an agency, accountable? So when 200 plus billion shillings is not spent, beyond just putting it in a report and saying we didn't spend and giving a few reasons here and there, is there somebody who is held responsible, whether it's from the planning point, whether it's during the budgeting itself, or even challenges during implementation? Is there anybody who is held accountable, right? The answer in Kenya is that not really, right? So the controller of budget will put out reports showing the underspending. Even if it's the counties, they will put out reports showing underspending, but you don't get to hear of any actions that are supposed to be taken to ensure that the people who are making this decision actually get a little bit more prudent in terms of how they plan and how they put 1 + 1 to add to 2. So I think there's an accountability matrix there that is a bit off. And even when the National Treasury puts out the gazettes and the circulars saying, prepare the budget and the following is the model through which we want you to do it, you don't see a mandate of responsibility of if things don't work well, so and so or agency XYZ is responsible for that. So there's a gap there in the fact that we don't see an incentive of why, if I'm the one who is responsible of implementing the budget or planning that the budget be fiscally sound, that there's a side of responsibility that I bear, right, when we underspend by 200 billion shillings. So I think that's one area that definitely needs some attention. Closely related to that is the role of Parliament. So in our budgeting arrangement, in our budgeting cycle, is that after every 3 months, there's a report that goes to Parliament saying this is how the budget implementation is playing out. This is where we are doing well. This is our burn rate. Even government has a burn rate, right? So here is where we are at the end of 3 months. And here is where things are going well or they are not going well. There'll be an effort of some sort to try and explain why the burn rate is the way it is. And Parliament is supposed to take that report, make sense of it, adjust policies if that's what's needed where things are not going right, and try and make sure that the next report is much better than the previous one, that in the next year, that implementation is better than it is. You don't get to hear much from Parliament about implementation. You hear a lot about audits, And even we are shown on TV when governors are called by the Senate, when different government agencies are called by the National Assembly to come and speak about audit queries that have been raised by the Auditor General. But we don't see that same vigor. Rigor at the point of when these reports are coming in every quarter. So the oversight of Parliament is definitely wanting, and I think is one of the areas where a lot of the questions on the challenges Kip spoke to will be answered. Right? So why is it that money is going late? Parliament and the Senate pass a cash flow disbursement schedule. You don't get to hear Parliament calling the National Treasury and saying, so why is that schedule not being followed? So there's a bit of an oversight gap that definitely Parliament can do a little bit more around. And it's good because Parliament is also organized around sector committees. So they can even call just the health part of the budget implementation crew and be able to ask questions, why are things not playing out the way we approved? Because remember, the budget is also approved by Parliament. So Parliament bears a huge responsibility of making sure that the decisions they approve, the decisions they pass, are actually being implemented as intended. Because I think that's something that is really critical. There's a side of citizens to this, which I think is good for us also to reflect on. When the budget is not implemented as intended, as I started, you lose trust with the public. But there's a whole other world there that plays out, right? So the public gets to feel, okay, fine, it's like we are giving you wishes, which you decide whether you want to implement them or not, despite the fact that they were approved in the budget. You lose trust also in terms of the public seeing their responsibility in terms of kind of being a bit more involved in that budget. One of the biggest challenges we see during budget implementation is that there is rarely a public involvement goal or effort by government and whatever layers of it exist to try and get the public to also be a bit more involved in that. So the citizen accountability side of it is quite weak. And not necessarily because citizens wouldn't bring value, but it's because the architecture of our budgeting processes has actually left out the citizen voice in the formal spaces of where we are monitoring the budget. So I think that's something that definitely could add a lot of value to the processes of making sure that budgets are implemented. Because if you put out a quarterly report that shows that the little hospital or the little school, the JSS one that Kip has spoken to in my village, needed 3 additional classes, and the report says, oh, even the money has not been released, I should have a space and a platform to be able to ask, why is that happening? The fact that in the formal arrangement that's not there, then it leaves the citizens a bit of a gray area, which I think is something that definitely could improve this. You spoke about donors. So Kenya is one of those countries that still receives quite some what we call overseas development assistance. And it means then we are getting forms of grants and support from other countries, but also from organizations like, the World Banks of this world. One of the things that was interesting for us in this study is that the underspending we saw, the 12% underspending that Kip spoke about 40% of it is explained by donor-related spending, which is quite significant. And I think one of the things that will be useful to think of there is, where does it go wrong when you are getting support, right? Kip spoke to the first one, which is the fact that you have monies that come with conditions, and those conditions to be fulfilled sometimes takes time. So which means then for the government is, by the time you are getting into these commitments and these conditions that you have to fulfill, the budget does not stop. It's still flowing. So you get to the end of the year, you've not spent because you had to fulfill and tick all these boxes. So you're not able to spend on time. So there's a good conversation there on how does our government negotiate, right? How do you not get funding that is a little bit more flexible? How do we end up in this funding that is very restrictive, right? Because that could be one area to free up a bit of the government's hand in terms of receipt and spending of donor funds. So I think that's one area that definitely could help improve, especially this part of the 40% of underspending that is related to external support. The other side, which is important, is also the calendars. I know this sounds simplistic, but if the Kenyan budget cycle, the implementation starts the implementation starts at on July 1st, and the donors, their calendar starts on January 1st. So it means we'll always be misaligned in terms of the calendars. When they can release the money on their side, it's not when we need it on this side, or at least it's not aligned in a way that it has to start being spent on this side. And that, I think, is something that definitely we've seen a lot of in different programs that are externally funded. And I think for the government, this also sits a little bit in the negotiation table, but it's really to ask, is it possible for the Kenyan government to negotiate for external support that is a little bit longer term? So we're not going year by year by year by year. So we are expecting disbursements, in the short term, and they're always late because the calendars are not aligned. What if you negotiated for a 5-year kind of an arrangement that allows you to have money that helps with the flexibility of aligning the budget cycles as well? I think in essence, we are dealing with challenges that have a lot to do with how we think of planning, how we raise resources, how we bring the citizen voice on board. And that then goes beyond just the numbers, because it means we have an opportunity to correct them at the foundational level as well.
Wow. So who should be held accountable? You're saying, you're not putting it very directly, but Parliament has a role to play in one way or the other. So someone should be responsible for all the underspending that we get to see. And maybe just a follow-up on the trust bit. Why is that important? Why should government care about cultivating trust with citizens? And what aspects would help build or cultivate that trust? Not just in, of course, the outcome we want to see. If you said you're going to build a dispensary, I want to see the dispensary. But are there other aspects within the process of how things happen? For instance, issues of transparency, and especially with regard to budget implementation. And I'll also keep respond to this in a bit when it comes to supplementary budgets and whether or not government has some fiscal discipline when it comes to that, and whether they're just in totality all wrong or should abandon them. But first, John, those two things.
Let me start with the trust and let me flip the coin. So if you don't implement budgets as intended, what happens if you don't do it as planned? Number one, of course, you have the challenge of people feeling that they are not respected, right? So we don't go through these 10 months plus of formulating the budget and approving it and getting our priorities into the budget, then you don't do it. Right? So first of all, you make the public feel like you're incompetent. Now, I know governments don't like looking incompetent, right? So it makes the government look incompetent, right? So that's one thing which I think is terrible when trust is broken, because the public feels like this government actually doesn't know what to do. So there's that side. There's also another side to it, which is the public feels, yes, the money was there, the priorities were clear, but you stole the money. So it looks like a corruption problem. Right? So you didn't implement the things we agreed to. The money was there. So why is that the case? You are corrupt. You ate the money. And Kenyans arrive at that conclusion very quickly, right? So there's that other side, which I think, again, is how that trust gets eroded. Is because the public feels you are incompetent, you are corrupt, you don't respect the wishes of the public. So again, it looks like every time citizens are consulted, in whatever fora of arrangement they are in, they feel that what you're making them do is developing a wish list, right? It's like a Christmas wish list for the Christmas. And they will decide who was naughty and who was not, and decide whether they will do or not. But that's not how budgets are supposed to work. Budgets are that there's a process. In that process, we negotiate. And once we've done with the negotiation, then you do your part, which as government is you get to implement those budgets. So all that then means the public trust towards government and its abilities to fulfill the mandate of meeting the needs of the public. And especially, as Kip said, especially of the very poor households, when that gets low. So trust is important, not just as a social contract arrangement, but it's actually important because it erodes also other areas of government and citizen interaction, which I think is something that in the Kenyan case is unfortunately at a very low level at this point. Sorry, I'm forgetting the second question. Yes. Now, number one, underspending is not unnatural, so it can happen, right? So you have a calamity, you have something that happens, you have COVID that affects government revenue. So it can happen. So it's not to say it can't happen. Even inflation, right? So inflation could shoot up, interest rates could shoot up that affect the ability of government to do certain things. There's nothing wrong with underspending. But when it happens, it has to happen because things were beyond the control of government. So number one is you have to be very transparent on why it happened. I think one of the challenges that we've had is that the government gets very sketchy and gets very scant with information when it comes to underspending. If you look at sector reports, a good example, we have sector reports that are prepared when we are formulating the budget. And you'll find a huge underspending of something billion shillings. And there's just one line that says funding was not enough. So like, okay, so what does that mean? So I think there's need for more transparency when it comes to why underspending is happening. And for me, that connects to there should be a very clear mandate by the National Treasury to all the ministries, departments, and agencies that anytime there's underspending, you have to provide a very clear justification on why that underspending happened. Because if you don't do that, we go back to the public trust side. So the public will think you're incompetent, they'll think you're corrupt, and that's why you're not being clear about why the underspending actually happened. So transparency is important. Justifying why things are not happening is also really important. I'll not escape the question of, so who is responsible? I'll make an effort at it. Number one, I think Parliament, so I agree with you, Parliament has to do more. As the owners of the final decision on the approved budget, they can do more. Number two, I feel that the mandate and the responsibility I was speaking about earlier on the incentive sits also with the National Treasury. The National Treasury directs and tells everybody what to do with the budget. It can mandate who is responsible. It can mandate what needs to be done. It can be clear, for example, that every spending has to connect to the non-financial side of performance. And if that does not happen, then these are the steps that have to be taken. So even just the linkage on the question you had asked, Kip, so who loses out when we don't implement budgets? The National Treasury holds the responsibility to be able to say, if that connection is not clear, if that connection is not being met because you are underspending, then the following are the repercussions for that. So I place a lot of weight on the National Treasury in terms of giving clear direction and mandate, and on Parliament for holding all those agencies accountable, including the National Treasury, at the point especially where revenue is involved.
Yeah, I want to agree with you on the trust bit and how citizens can be very suspicious of government. I attended the public sector hearings the other day as a member of the public. And one thing stood out for me when they were presenting, and they said that they wanted to target close to 11 or 10 million girls with free sanitary pads. And so I went back to the sector report, the social protection sector report, and the target for 2024 and 2025 had not been met at all, not even once. And so I was curious, so how are you going to target 11 million at the 2-point-something million that you're to target? You're not targeting. That was eyebrow raising for me. So I was very suspicious of government and what they were promising that they would do. And I didn't have trust that they would be able to accomplish that. And I did raise that question. So I agree. Kip, supplementary budgets, can they enhance credibility, or it is just something that we all need to look at with caution?
I think I'll put in that side of we need to look at it in a caution way. Although sometimes it might enhance credibility in some, and I'll explain. And I have said earlier that over the last few years, like between 2019, 20 and 2022, 2023, we had about 10 supplementary budgets that were passed by in that 4 years. Meaning each financial year there is at least 2 or 3 supplementary budgets that national government budget to legislate. And in such cases, we should ask ourselves, why supplementary budget? Why do we need it? Of course, there are conditions that are already provided by the law, and John have already talked about. Like there's an unforeseen circumstance and there's an unavoidable circumstance. Like there are those two. For instance, during the COVID period, there was a need to try to align because it wasn't foreseen in such, or it was unavoidable in such a case. But when you find a situation where even a small thing probably it could lead to a supplementary budget, then it means it's not used for the right purpose. Because sometimes there's a change in slightly on policy, And you will see government saying, we are doing this supplementary because of this change. And in such cases, you tend to realize it might not really align well. But of course, we are also alive to sometimes when there is an under collection of revenue, it might lead to supplementary budgets. But to what extent should the changes be affected, even in sectors, ministries, and programs? Like, to what extent should supplementary budgets change those? Because remember, already there are changes that might happen even without supplementary budgets, and government might use that. But in most cases, you tend to find in supplementary budget one, you might find a sector or a department losing. Then when you go to supplementary budget two, it still loses. Like, so this is just something like recurring. Like, it loses here and in the next. And in the end, it also still left to challenges of budget credibility. You still might find that maybe that department or that ministry or that program might not have still utilized it, despite there were some reduction. Like, so some of the challenges still comes from the approval, like the planning side of the budget, which means even for us, and also you talk about the sector hearings, like even for the citizen and public, we still need to really be present in those forums, like the sector hearings that government calls for, or even during approval stage budget estimates. Like, we still need to be present so that we are also able to check and of course be able to provide our views on site. Because remember, poor planning at the end of the day will lead to poor implementation, because all such will mostly emanate from this. And some of the things, of course, that I have seen maybe in some of the planning documents that government to provide, you sometimes find that they also say over the coming financial year, these are things that we'll prioritize. So we'll prioritize completion of certain capital projects, all this. They usually provide some of the criteria in which they will prioritize certain allocations. But rarely do they stick to that. Because sometimes you find some projects are almost completed, but they are not completed. And even in some cases, they usually say in supplementary budget, we want to address some of the challenges relating to certain projects. But then that does not happen at the end of like, these supplementary budgets are not used for the right cause. But if they could be to course correct what probably they are saying, probably this should be addressed, probably it could have led to better outcomes, especially towards the end. And of course, even for citizens and all of us, the public, we need also to be watchful. Like, we are seeing a lot of projects that probably are coming, the government is undertaking. We need to be there in those projects, just go and checking and asking more about such projects. Because sometimes when in the reports, you might find the documents or the reports that government produces, they might be reading, saying what is different from what you observe in the ground. So it's what for all of us to be watchful on such projects, because we know there are many projects. And remember, when we see discipline in certain projects being implemented well, because it will lead to more better credibility. And yeah.
Wow. So I like that poor planning will almost always lead to poor budget implementation. But we also understand that in certain instances, you cannot plan for everything one for one. There will be certain unforeseen circumstances. I know this is a term that most of us don't like hearing because of how it's been misused. But if that is the case and we are using supplementary budgets more for cost correction and not bringing about further deviations, then that can be a good use of this budget revisions. I like that. As we get to closing this conversation today, just one question, because we've talked about the issues, the problems, some solutions here and there, putting both of you on the spot. If today, and of course we're living in the era of executive orders and whatnot. So if today you had power, either you are at the helm of the National Treasury or at the helm of Parliament with regard to budgets and appropriation, so the committee, I'll let you choose which one you think has a lot more power to implement the reforms that you'll perhaps want to implement. What is that one thing, very briefly, that one thing that you'd say, this is my day one in office, this is the first thing I'm going to implement in order to bring about certain improvements. It may not happen that day, but it will perhaps have ripple effects and improve credibility in the long run. Who wants to start first?
I can start.
Okay.
If I was the CS in charge of the National Treasury, on day one, the first thing I will do is make sure that there's a mandate across government that every budget line has to be connected to an actual service goal. And that when you underspend, then we'll not discuss by how much you underspend. We'll discuss by how much services Kenyans did not get. And you will take accountability for that. We'll not have a discussion about you didn't spend 100 shillings. We'll have a discussion that there are 2 children that were not immunized. I think that mandate would really put an incentive, not just within government, but even outside government, on what is the impact of underspending. And I will give very clear guidelines on how that evaluation will be done. I will work closely with the controller of budget to make sure that that independent part of the evaluation is also strengthened. So whether it's by giving additional resources to the controller of budget and making sure that that strength is there. That mandate will also localize how budget credibility is reviewed. We'll get out of these block numbers at the national level and go to what budget credibility means for a health facility or for a school. So that, again, budget credibility is not seen as this thing that flies over people's heads, but actually what it means at the point of service delivery. So it will be a mandate that will be very clearly connecting underspending to services and also where those services meet the people. So the language of budget credibility and absorption would leave the lofty boardrooms of the national level and actually be in the small rooms where Kenyans access services, where they get their national IDs, where they get their their health services and where they get their education. And that then will drive, I think, a stronger voice of citizens being able to see who is failing them. Because right now is English. Yeah.
Wow, you might just end up being the most loved and hated person in equal measure.
I think
Depends with who. But thanks for sharing that, John. Keep.
Yes, I think I'm one of those people who agree with the zero-based budgeting. Like, if in my day one, because I would ask everyone to justify why they need certain resources, and especially on the recurrent and of course everything personnel and all that. And if that is done, of course I should be able to know for this department or for this ministry, this is what they need, and the reason why they need these resources is because they want to achieve this and this and this, as John said. I think that would be my key thing that I want to achieve with that. And also when you see, in most cases, also development then to serve, I think also I will not be able to leave out the development, because in most, even when you see credibility, that's where a lot of challenges comes in. The procurement part is something that must be corrected in this, especially in this country. Like it's a challenge that it's visible and everyone is seeing. Like procurement probably is where things get clogged and things are not moving. Despite there are a lot of reforms, there are a lot of has been spent on the systems that are supposed to streamline procurement, but still we are not seeing that translating to improve credibility and of course to improve the services. That is also something that I would think of immediately, because in most cases a lot of resources are put there, and which accountability is somewhat challenging. Yeah.
Wow. So you're saying that the numbers have to mean something. They do mean something. They're not just numbers. And we have to justify every shilling. Of course, we started at the beginning and we talked about the fiscal space that you're operating in with the public debt that you have to service and all that. And every shilling counts. Every shilling matters. It has to be justified. We have to be accountable. That is, the government has to be accountable to citizens in every shape, manner, form. Be transparent as well. And that this conversation that we've had here today, it's definitely a relevant conversation, especially in the current context. We've been making reference to this study that we did, the research paper. Is it available?
Yes. The paper is already available online. It's available in Fiscal, and just search Kenya's budget credibility, realities and expectation and realities. And you'll be able to find that piece of paper. And of course, you can be able to read and of course interact also with us. And also we'll also publish in our website, bajetihub.org. You'll also be able to find that paper at some point. Yeah.
Wow, thank you very much, John. Thank you, Kim, for the amazing insights that you've shared. I've also learned a lot. And I hope that our listeners have also picked something, a thing or two, depending on where you are. If you're an ordinary citizen, if you're a policymaker, if you're a civil society actor, and if you're just curious about what is happening in this country, I hope you picked something. And thank you very much. Stay informed. You can keep learning by following Bajeti Hub on every platform. And until next time, that's it for the Bajeti Speaks podcast. We'll see you then.